Shabbat Shalom. Today, looking further into the realistic history of this Jewish family of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and trying to answer the question I asked myself and am posing today as something to ponder about. The distance between heaven and earth is just a little bit further than a ladder's length. What is that supposed to mean? We're going into it and we'll find it out today. It's the Parashat Vayetze in the book of Genesis, in the book of Bereshit. And let's start with the first text of the three main texts, and we have the other texts to illustrate what the line of thought of today is going to be. Torah, Genesis chapter 28, verse 10 through 15, in an answer to not only that ladder length question, but also to the question of how to deal, how to cope with oppression, how to cope with difficult situations in our lives, because that's what this whole situation is saying. It's not the Holy Family and that's it. No, it's a family in sometimes in misery and despair and all the things that we also experience in our lives. There we go. Jacob left Beersheba and he went toward Haran. He came to a certain place and stayed there that night, because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed. He dreamed that there was a ladder set up on the earth. The top of it reached to heaven. There we have it. You could see that the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. See it before you. The Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Jacob, the God of Isaac. I will give the land on which you lie down to you and to your descendants. Your descendants will be numerous, like the dust of the earth, and you will spread abroad to the west and the east and the north and the south. By you and your descendants, all the families of the earth will bless themselves. See it, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go. And I will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done that of which I've spoken to you. Beautiful words to receive when somebody is finding out what believing in God is all about, and there is no Bible to get lessons from. It's between God and himself, which is very interesting, and of course his whole infrastructure, the family that he's born into, all these things. But it's not always not all nice and sweet. Jacob is a refugee. He is running away from his brother Esau, who is threatening to kill him, like his grandfather Cain had done with his brother Abel. Now it looks like people like Cain and also like Esau solve their problems their way. If something doesn't fit into their schedule, so if it goes against their will, they kill. Or they run away, like in marriages and sometimes in congregations. Or there is another way to take revenge, for instance, by spreading lies about someone with a very face of sadness, a nice act, through which the people who listen to that person think that you are a loving person and that you're just really trying to find a solution, and you're not the perpetrator. On his way, Jacob is able to get some rest, but there is still this oppression, this feeling of anxiety, and it's increasing the more he comes into the neighborhood in the proximity of his uncle Laban in Hebrew. Now in Jacob's life, this stress is expressing itself in receiving a vision of God. Most probably, the big pressure that Jacob lives under is also a formation of his character, which is interesting if you can live that way. That pressure can be used in a different way than somebody who would exert that pressure on you would have meant. Something like Psalms 77 verse 2. In the time of my trouble, I seek the Lord. In the night my hand is stretched out without wearying. My soul refuses to be comforted. That's one thing. And what happens when we live in this kind of oppression, especially when we call it upon ourselves? Look at Psalms 119 verse 67. Before I was afflicted, I went astray. David is saying this about himself very honestly. He says, but now I keep your word. What happened in the meantime, David? Well, I went astray, and all of a sudden I began to realize that I was not doing the right things, going the right road, the right path, and I changed and I asked forgiveness to God, and I discovered His word, and it spoke to my heart. I knew it, but it never meant so much to me as from that moment on. And so I was afflicted, I went astray, but now I keep your word. And look a little bit further on in the same Psalm, 119, and then verse 71. It's good for me that I was afflicted. It was good, that I may learn your statutes. So it was that Jacob receives a very interesting, let's call it a vision. Don't call it a dream, which is not real. There's more reality to this vision than you might think. This is an opportunity, literally a window of opportunity through which Jacob is allowed, enabled to see a part of the spiritual reality which is all around us. And so he saw this vision of God when he was at the verge to meet his brother Esau. Now, before Jacob arrives at the house of Uncle Laban, it's before that meeting that he has this special vision, this image, this special picture into the spiritual reality. He's seeing God in the heavens. There's a ladder that is connecting the earth with the heavens, and on the top of the ladder there's God. And there are angels climbing up and others descending down. In the vision, God speaks to Jacob. And imagine this and realize this didn't happen to me. I never saw this. This is the reality of what Jacob has. You can only see these things when you have the Spirit of God in you. Israel had the Spirit of God. Through these things you might say, no, they didn't have it because that come much later. You cannot see these things without the Spirit of God. That's the reality. And so don't go wander off into theological constructions to prove that Israel didn't have the Spirit of God, because it fits your picture of Israel and your picture of the Bible. Let the Bible speak and give the pictures, not you giving your pictures to the Bible. So angels are climbing up and down, and in the vision God speaks to Jacob. It looks all nice and spiritual and beautiful and sweet, but it's not all sweet. There's something going on with this vision. It's never only sweet. God is always working, and we need to see that the Bible is not some kind of nice picture book or fairy tales, but is a book that is full of warnings to keep us on the straight, right, small path. The Lord confirms the promises and everything that Jacob received through the blessings of his father. When Jacob wakes up, he calls this place in Hebrew Sha'ar HaShamayim, the gate of the heavens. That's what that means. Sha'ar HaShamayim. Like the word, perhaps you heard the neighborhood in Jerusalem, Mea She'arim. It's the same word Sha'ar HaShamayim, but then in the plural, Mea She'arim, 100 gates. In this only gate, one gate, Sha'ar, only one, HaShamayim, of the heavens. The distance between heaven and earth is just a little bit further than a ladder's length, was my situation, my sentence, my beginning phrase of this study. And the question now is, how long is that? How long is a ladder's length? In our time, when somebody says that, he means, or she means, in terms of how many meters or kilometers in terms of heaven and earth. In the Bible, the focus is on something else than the amount of kilometers. And we'll look at that and we'll find out. I promise. First, a little bit of calculation, calculus. Ishmael is 74 years old when Jacob is born. Isaac has 2 sons, and Ishmael was 14 years older than his brother Isaac, and Jacob has 2 sons. Isaac has 2 sons, and Isaac was 60 when Jacob and Esau were born. You can find that in Genesis 25 verse 26. Ishmael died when he was 137 years old. You find that in Genesis 25 verse 17. Jacob was 63 years old then. You can calculate that. In the end, Jacob is 130 years old. 130 years old. Remember this years amount. When he stands, as father of Joseph, in the meantime, the vice king, the vice Pharaoh of Egypt, when Jacob stands in front of the Pharaoh of Egypt himself. Big happening when you are allowed to stand there. You find that in Genesis 47 verse 9. Jacob is 130 years old when this special moment takes place, a very important moment that takes place. The Pharaoh invites him, asks him about his age, and so that's why we know. And the focus, don't read too quick and realize, wow, the Bible is standing still by the amount of years, the age that Jacob has at that moment. Must be important to mention that in the text, and yes it is. Why? Well, it so happens that the numerical value, the gematria, of the Hebrew word for ladder that this text is talking about in Genesis 28 verse 12 is also 130. Is there a connection? I think there is. The word in Hebrew is the word sulam, not sh. That's the name of a friend in Jerusalem, close to Jerusalem anyway, but the word sulam with a clear S, this S, this samach, has the numerical value of 60. Sulam, the L, the lamed, has the value of 30, and the mem, sofit, the end mem, is 40. So add up 60, 30 and 40, and you come to 130 also. What? If there's a connection between those two, what is it? This is how careful you need to deal with numerical values, and don't just get something and a contraption about which you can say whatever you want. Be very careful, and also only say something in terms of it seems to me that, and so forth. So look for a moment at the situation of Israel being in the land of Egypt. First it is friendly, then it's not, it turns for the worst, and it is temporarily connected with the very earthbound, cruel, oppressing, very dark land, world power at the time called Egypt, Mitzrayim in Hebrew. Jacob is at the moment where this land is still sort of friendly, business-like, but friendly to Israel. But it takes a turn southward later on, and this is what it's. This is that moment before the bad things are taking place. That this meeting between Jacob and Pharaoh presents itself. It presents itself. Jacob dies in the end and is bombed and is buried in the cave of Machpelah. You find that in Genesis 50, verse 13. Look at it. It's a very interesting name, that word Machpelah. Perhaps you heard it in studies before, that the word in the Hebrew, this name Machpelah, has the significance of doubling, making something double. That looked like one thing, and you double it, you multiply it so that it becomes double. Which has the spiritual implication of somebody who is lying there, whose body is buried there, reached the spiritual level of spiritual being, of the new man, in which somebody then is not only an earthly human being, but also has already the Spirit of God in herself or in himself before passing away. And Jacob has the promise of returning to the land, received it from God. Joseph will help him and care for him, take care of him, and close his eyes when he dies. After he died, I mean. This experience of the latter had the same elements. There is this connection of heaven and dark earth, like Jacob had in this connection with the Pharaoh, and the promise of returning. As if God knew beforehand, of course he knew it, and wanted to show and teach how spiritually these things are connected with each other. And the Lord is strongly committed and involved and present in the life of Jacob to give him this unique, but not only in the Bible mentioned, experience of this letter. Jacob is in the process of becoming a man of God, which is a very important experience. A man of God. Am I a man, or the other half of the human race, are you a woman of God? Is a very important question you need to ask at times in your life, with all the responsibilities that come with it. No, it's not perfect living at all, because we are still on earth. We are still in this valley of the shadow of death, as it says in Psalm 23, like all of us. God loves Jacob. He hated Esau, which is interesting saying, but that's a different study last week. But he loves Jacob like he loves everybody who is searching for God in a very honest, open, modest, respectful way, and who loves God. And he shows Jacob that there are parallels in his life with Numbers, of the age of Jacob and the letter, which I think is a connection, that point at God's control and God's government. Now that counts for all of us. We need to look for those parallels. We need to look for the moments where we see the connection between heaven and earth. Keep on searching. See oppression as the means, not to see how miserable you are, but what you have reached and how God is getting you through the situation that is in itself very rotten. Oppression, see it as a means to be able to grow. Never give up. Because at the moment that you are able to do that, you are above the circumstances in which you live. As a means to grow, you are master of your situation. And there are special examples of this, like Daniel, in the book of Daniel, in the den with the lions. He's above the situation because he's totally unapproachable by those lions. They don't do anything against him. He's the lion whisperer. Let's look at the book of Haftorah in order to see how this continues, and we search more on this latter experience. Hosea 12, verse 13 through 15, of a bigger, larger text, where it goes to chapter 14, verse 10. So let's read. Jacob fled to the land of Aram. Hosea looks back at that moment, at that text and that history. There, Israel, he changes the word Jacob into Israel. I'll get back to this. There, Israel did serve for a wife, and for a wife he herded sheep. By a prophet, Moses, the Lord brought Israel up from Egypt, and by a prophet he was preserved. Ephraim has given bitter provocation. Oh, this is a very serious text. So his Lord will leave this blood guilt upon him and will turn back upon him his reproaches. Ephraim has given bitter provocation. Now we need to pay attention to what we're saying, is what Hosea says. Hosea is warning, mind your words. Ephraim provoked bitterly. We are growing in biblical terms on an olive tree with a holy root, meaning Abram, Isaac, and Jacob. This tree has two types of wood that grow on it. The original olive tree, which is Israel, and the wild branches from the wild olive tree being grafted into this cultured, this noble olive tree. This is the picture that you find throughout the Hebrew Bible, and Paul picks it up in his letter to the Romans. It's an important picture in the Bible, an important image, because connected with it is not that we are so cuddling up on this olive tree, because you're broken away from it by arrogance, by provoking bitterly. So watch out what you say, because provoking is done by words and deeds also, but it starts with words or deeds. It depends on which angle you take. Be careful, because God is in control. And this is what Hosea is warning against. This is another picture, a loved one of the Lord, who is resisting and is disobedient, Ephraim. So there's a difference between Jacob and Israel on the one hand, and Ephraim on the other hand, and then there is also this person Esau, Edom, which you find, who is hated by God. Now that's a different category, but it all belongs together. Ephraim will be restored if he allows it and does his homework, and he has more homework to do than when he didn't, if he hadn't provoked so bitterly. Ephraim brings himself into the greatest of difficulties by continually resisting and being bitter, in fact against God himself, because people who are bitter have a character that grows into this bitterness because there is something wrong with their trust in the Lord, something wrong with their trust in God, and they might spread it among people, their bitterness, and infect them with their bitterness. But in fact, there is something wrong in the connection between that person and God Himself. So there are these three aspects: Jacob, who grows into Israel, Ephraim, and then the third group called Esau, which are groups in the world, but there are also three aspects in ourselves. It's not a trinity in ourselves, not at all, on the contrary. It's three aspects, and we need to be aware of those three, and we need to make sure that we only choose for the Jacob position, which is growing into the Israel position, and we need to be we need to distance ourselves from the position of Ephraim and never get even in the close proximity or even far proximity of this Esau person. But we have all three tendencies in our innermost being. Those groups are in the world or in ourselves. The group of Jacob, and we are loved by God. We're definitely not perfect. We make mistakes, but we will learn, and we see misery as a time to grow. Sometimes by knowing it intellectually, but not emotionally, and then our brain has to tow us through the situation with God pushing us from behind. And sometimes we are more in tune with what we're dealing with, but it's not always easy. But we will learn. We will want to learn always, and we're always willing and always ready to see our own responsibility. We are looking for freedom, but never at the cost of other people, because then we're egotistically narcissists, and we don't want that. So there's that group. We will be oppression. We will meet oppression, but we will take it as an opportunity to grow. Now you might say, I'm not there yet. Okay, but see it as a process of spiritual growth, and see it as a process of spiritual formation. Then there's the group of Ephraim, loved by God, not hated like Esau, but terribly doing your own thing. Like Frank Sinatra was singing, do it my way, like that. Bitter in the soul, disobedient, uncontrollable. You meet oppression, but you don't grow through it, and you don't allow it to form and mold you. Not perfect, and eager to blame other people and circumstances, looking for tension and sensation, causing accidents also for other people, and finding ways to evade the pressure instead of seeking God, making victims, but saved if you allow God to grab you while you climbed the hill. You gave up and you rolled back down, and you have to get up and climb that hill again, and after 2, 3 times, 5 times, 10 times, you might give up. Never give up. And then there's the group called the group of Esau, hated by God, resisting, not even feeling God anymore, not in touch with the results of your own actions. You have no idea that you're saying things that hurt other people. You're not interested in that. You are blind and deaf to that. Untamable. And you will not be saved. You have a hardened heart. Your bitterness has become your new abode. You have been given over to a spirit of depravity. You're on a different track. You might be a believer. Don't take me wrong. You can be a believer and do this. This is the very tricky thing here. Esau knew everything because he grew up in a spiritual family. But then, if you are a believer, you're religious for outward form and exposure and showing off, not more than that. So much for that. Let's go to the New Testament text in order to read that too. Acts, the book of Acts, the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 1, verse 16 through 20. Brethren, brothers and sisters, the scripture had to be fulfilled, which the Holy Spirit spoke beforehand by the mouth of David, concerning Judas, this Judas Iscariot that you find in the New Testament, who was guide to those who arrested the Messiah Yeshua. Once he was numbered among us, also a disciple and a student, a Talmid of the Messiah, and he was allotted his share in this ministry. But now this man bought a field with the reward of his wickedness. Falling headlong, he burst open in the middle, and all his bowels gushed out. And it became known to all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so that the field was called in their Aramaic language Chakal Dema. Chakal Dema. Dema is the Aramaic word for dam, which is is the Hebrew word for blood, and Chakal is the field. So then there is the field of blood. Verse 20, for it's written in the book of Psalms, let his habitation become desolate, and let there be no one to live in it, and his office let another take. Interesting text, because his office was taken by another disciple later on in the book of Acts, and the place where this guy was buried is still desolate in the middle of Jerusalem, in the old city. Like Esau and Laban, this Judas person is a man who made very serious wrong choices by which he harmed people and mocked God. And he is removed from the congregation of followers of Yeshua. How did he die? We don't know exactly. It looked like he ran on his donkey wildly, rode into his area that he bought on a run, and then with that run he hit on a stone and died, or he took his own life and fell on the ground, and whatever it was the end of his life. Also a person who used his tongue wrong, like Ephraim, who was giving a bitter provocation. He literally betrayed Yeshua. We might do this by our acts, and we don't mean it, but this person did it on purpose. Although Yeshua is asking for certain people, forgive them because they don't know what they're doing. They don't realize how far this is reaching in terms of consequences. Died in hell. The word Chakal Dema is a place south of the Gehinnom valley in Jerusalem. There's still no houses there, and there's still a place that is not inhabited. Serious situation. Never get into this one. So about this dream of the ladder, which you find in Genesis 28 verse 12, there are two groups of angels. One group is ascending, one group is descending. That situation is not one that is standing alone. At the moment that Jacob returns to the promised land, he meets angels. You found in Genesis 32 verse 1 and 2. Let's read it, by the way. You find it on your screen and on your monitor, and I'll see it here in my text. Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, "This is God's army." See how spiritual this man is. He sees beings, he recognizes them as angels, and he calls the name of that place Machanaim, which is a very interesting name. because the word aim shows that there are two things, like the word for hand in Hebrew, also now, is the word yad, and two hands are not in the plural yadim, but yadayim, and this ending aim is to signify that those two things belong together. They're not complete if there's only one of them. It's two that is the complete picture. The same thing with this army of angels. There is Jacob's army and there is the angels' army, and together they are machanaim. They are two camps, but they belong together, meaning that what Yeshua says in Matthew 18, that every child, and from childhood on, later on till the end of your life, you have beings, spiritual beings, angels, who are watching you and keeping watch, but they're also watching the face of God on a daily basis. So they are in touch with God, and yet also with from the moment you were a child. And so these angels are taking care of and are watching Jacob and are guarding him. And that's why he calls it Machanaim. Not only is this spiritual man able to see that there are angels, who of us have seen angels, but also he can see that they belong to his camp as a parallel camp on the spiritual side, only visible for those who have spiritual eyes, and you find that very sporadically in the Bible. And he gives this name from the singular machane to machanaim, meaning two camps belonging together, because the one camp is the spiritual original of the earthly copy, belonging together and going together. The one is watching over the other one and stuff like that. Very interesting, because we might have these same situations. The Bible says in Matthew 18 that we have these situations. Those angels are there, and it's a reality, a protection. If we're close to them and we are able to be led by them, everything goes well. If not, then we have our own consequences. Two camps, Jacob's and the angels, watching over him. The plan of restoration is started with Abraham. His son Isaac follows his father Abraham. Jacob, Abraham's grandson, is actively involved in this same plan of restoration and salvation that God has with Israel and the rest of the world. Jacob is observing how angels are involved in this plan, with the Lord at the top as the conductor and the one who is the producer of this whole happening that we are experiencing in our lives now and later. The fact that Jacob watches the angels and he observes them and he encounters them and he's aware of them when he returns in the land of Israel, that has a meaning. The meaning is that the restoration continues at that moment. That restoration started with Abraham, and then later on it continues. Believing in God is not a normal thing. It's not it's a normal thing. It's supernatural thing. Believing in God, but it's only the beginning. Believing in God touches a person, man or woman, child or adult. Believing in God touches someone, not more than that. But it should. You might say, I've never been touched. It should touch you. Trusting Him will change you. That's a step further. Trusting God will change you. Obeying God will renew you. Enough texts in the Bible that there is a renewal within human beings when they allow God not only in their lives in terms of believing that he exists, but also trusting him in what he says, for instance, but also obeying in what he says. But now you have to have spiritual ears in order to hear what he says. And this is also a text that has repeatedly existed in the Bible, and it will renew you. Being touched, being changed, being renewed. We see this in this holy family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their wives and family. Abraham had a personal meeting with God after he had agreed with the commandment of circumcision. Abraham had the smell, the holy odor, the atmosphere of the destination of his own life and of the life of humankind, if we're doing the right thing, in the cave of Machpelah, this place, this graveyard, this cave in Hebron, where the arch fathers and mothers have been buried, except Rachel. His son, Abraham's son, Yitzchak, Isaac, was a man of prayer. It made him a sensitive person, sensitive enough in order to pick up this same smell and this atmosphere of the destination of his life and of the life of humankind, and to observe that smell when his son Jacob came to him to say, "I'm your son Esau, bless me," which was a trick, which is not punished, but was necessary because there was a promise that needed to be fulfilled, that the younger son would be served by the older one and would take over in terms of the firstborn. And Esau had already sold his right of being the firstborn, so it was a rightful thing to change that, because the blind Isaac was not totally present there and aware of what had taken place. Jacob himself had the dream of the ladder, fleeing from his brother who wanted to kill him, on his way to his future wives, that is to say. After he wakes up from the dream, he was saying the following words, and you see this, you can read this in Genesis chapter 28, verse 16 and 17. Then Jacob woke up from his sleep and said, "Surely the Lord is in this place. I did not know it." He was in awe, and Jacob said, "How awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God. This is the Shar HaShamayim. This is the gate of heaven." We saw this already before. So also this Jacob person has had his taste of heaven, paradise. The people that God chose to restore humankind has a very sound spiritual basis. 3 men that observed the destination of humankind. In the meantime, Israel received the Bible in terms of the Torah and the prophets and the scriptures that came after that, before the New Testament was given. Messiah came out of Israel. The promised land came out of Israel. That all and more came into being because of God's choosing. In the dream, angels climb up and descend. In the dream, God says to him, Genesis 28 verse 14, "Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, so numerous they will be. You will spread abroad to the west and to the east and the north and the south, and by you and your descendants all the families of the earth will bless themselves." That is not just a nice thing to say by God. No, this is a verdict with a military and a spiritual and even more economic aspect. Climbing angels shows that there is a distance between heaven and earth. There's a difference between heaven and earth. And you need to see that. If you are aware of that distance, then you can seriously look into the possibility of being in the heavenly situation, not only when you die, but even before, with a down payment in the terms of the Spirit of God. Also, because of the latter situation, we see that people are spiritual beings partially, and they want to live eternally, but they need to obey the rules that God has given, not their own rules. The Torah is the place where you can find those rules. Yeshua talks about it and teaches from it. Nothing in the New Testament gives even the suggestion that Torah is over with. Yeshua says it literally, I never came to end the Torah and the prophets. I came to fulfill it, and so you. He says in Matthew 5, verse 19, so do you. You also need to fulfill that. In the course of history, there will be world powers where normal people like you and me are bowed under and are servants and are used for wars and stuff like that. Babylon, the Medes, the Persians, the Greek Empire, Edom, Europe, Rome is the last one. Those are the biblical names for these four. One, the Medes and the Persians counted as one. And it's important that while you are in that, under that government of those empires, that you follow the government of the Lord, but never at the cost of your obedience to your country. The Bible shows from Moses on to the New Testament, where Paul says the same, honor your government, honor the emperor, honor the king. It's very important to be a citizen of the world, because this is one way to honor God. But never exchange the two. See the difference between the world power and the culture and the growing wild and aggression and the rudeness of people and the rawness of people and all the ethics that are still more and more invisible on the one hand, and then God's government. God is above the ladder, on the top of the ladder. He is above history, above any government on earth. He's the real boss. But he also is the one who loves you and me. But he is only your God if you learn to not only know him and trust him, but also obey him. So take rest. Take moments of silence daily. Learn to take those moments in a world full of busyness, loudness, and full agendas. Learn to think about things, situations, people. Learn to do it in an honest way. Show respect in your thinking, especially about people that you don't like. And never return an unjust act with an unjust act. Learn to recognize Torah that was given by God to Moses and then to Israel and then to the world, and learn to obey it and to practice it and to apply it. Learn to tame your tongue. Learn to say beautiful things. Learn to sing beautiful songs. Learn to bless people. Perhaps especially those that you don't like. Not easy. Today we read how the mighty archfather Jacob is fooled by his uncle Laban. He's getting into trouble like anybody in the world. Uncle Laban is fooling Jacob by not telling him that it is the practice and the tradition in their culture to marry the oldest daughter as the first one, and then later on the younger. Jacob might have known it, but he was promised that he would marry Rachel. Not so. So that's one thing that he's fooled with. Also, he's not paid well and not paid honestly for the work that he does for his uncle. And this continues, and he works 7 years, and he thought and was promised to marry Rachel, but it was Leah. So he works another 7 years, that's 14 years, then he marries the girl that he was meant to marry. And then he stays for another 6 years if only to show to his uncle Laban and to God and to himself and the people around him, I'm not a victim of the circumstances. I'm above it. I leave when I decide to leave. Not too early, because that's running away. I leave at the moment where it's the most noble way to take my suitcases and go. Laban doesn't change, and he continues to be the one who is fooling and is deceiving. Jacob is a man of God, has become a man of God, saw his name change from Jacob to Israel. He is the one who's watching angels, as we have seen in Genesis 32, verse 1 and 2. And like Jacob, who is deceived and feels miserable and has had no way of being given any advantage because he's Jewish or whatever, and so was fooled 20 years long, but he knew it and he was master of the circumstances. He couldn't change the circumstances, he could change himself. This can happen to us as well. Whoever you are, wherever you live, you can be the master of the circumstances. Now don't imitate Peter, who, when Yeshua is on a boat with his disciples and Peter comes a little later, or no, he's in the boat, I'm sorry, and Yeshua comes a little later, walks on the water. That is really being the master of the circumstances, also the physical laws of nature. And Peter says, oh, I try to do that too, and Yeshua says, try it. There is that difference between the mastership that we might not be able to reach. And Yeshua says, I'm just a little bit more human than you are, a little bit more God than you will have ever in you. So the art of living is not trying to become someone else. The art of living is to learn who you are. And then not say, oh, now I know who I am, but to learn to have a measure instrument, the Bible, of which James, Yaakov, in the Bible, in the New Testament, at the end, says that it is the document in which you see yourself as in a mirror. When you see yourself, try to see the good things and the bad things and be thankful for the good things and improve them, and see the things in which you need to improve more because they're not so good things. And then you use this connection of the visible, touchable Bible and the less visible, less touchable God in order to help you through the circumstances of your life. What did Jacob do that helped him? He looked at things in a different way. There's a nice example in this piece that I want to share with you. Jacob and his uncle do something which is in that time a special significance. They build a pile of stones. And with that they promise to each other being faithful and peace, having peace among each other. And they give that pile of stones a name. And interestingly enough, it's not the same word. Laban gives a different name than Jacob. Let's read in Genesis 31, verse 47, and then we go back to the letter because we're not done with that. There needs to be an answer still. So chapter 31, verse 47, Laban called that pile of stones Yegar Sahaduta. Jacob called it Gal-ed. Hey, listen, we are working with a document that is written in Greek, New Testament, Hebrew, Torah, and sometimes in Aramaic. And this is that Aramaic language again. And two guys look at the same thing, but the pile of stones mean something different for the one compared to what the other is experiencing. What does that mean, what Laban says? Yegar Sahaduta. It's Aramaic and it means a pile of stones of the testimony. It's a factual name. Nothing wrong with it. that is what that pile of stones is. It's a pile of stones being a testimony. What is the name that Jacob gives to the same pile of stones? Gal-ed in Hebrew. By watching what the meaning is of this word, we might realize how Jacob looks at things. Gal-ed, two words brought together. Ed means testimony, witness. That's that word. Then the word gal, which together with the word ed becomes gal-ed. Gal is an important word in the Bible, also in the New Testament. It means wave, it means mountain, from a verb, galal, that means to roll. And when you bring this word gal together, then you get the Aramaic word galgal or Golgotha. It's a doubling, believe me. And what is Golgotha? Golgotha. It's the place where the greatest faithfulness and the strongest peace were made by the sacrifice of our Messiah, Yeshua. Is it possible that Jacob, the man who saw angels in his life more than once, and saw God above a ladder reaching heavens, is it possible that Jacob gave the name Gal-ed, the place of the sacrifice of the Messiah, as a testimony to the pile of stones, with in his head, in his mind, in his heart, the idea of the sacrifice of Yeshua? I think it's possible. In Hebrews 11:9, it says, by faith Abraham sojourned in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with his son and grandson, Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. Now, how much aware was Jacob of this promise, I don't know. But how aware are you of God's protection and his healing and his guidance in your life? I need to ask myself the same question. And how obedient are you to him each moment when God speaks? And do you hear his voice like Jacob did? It's a high spiritual level this man had, so we need to learn, we need to grow in this aspect. We might not see angels in the span of our lifetimes. Jacob did, special man, had his difficulties. It took years before he grew out of them, especially he's missing his son Joseph. But his faith and his trust in God was only grown, and he was touched, and he was guided by God, and he was changed by God. What did he do with his deceiving uncle Laban? He called the pile of stones after the sacrifice, perhaps. I'm guessing that he did that because of the words, the choice of words. After the sacrifice of Yeshua, why did he do that? A pile of stones, sacrifice of Yeshua? Perhaps to get the protection that the sacrifice of Yeshua also produces. It produces eternal life if you believe in that sacrifice, because you realize then that you cannot reach heaven by yourself. You cannot climb that ladder on your own power. But it also protects in this life against the deception of his family. Perhaps that Jacob did it for that reason as well. I think because of that same reason, Yeshua told in the New Testament, in John 1 verse 52, the following words. Yeshua says to Nathanael, "Truly, truly, I say to you, you will see heaven opened." You will have that spiritual level to see that. "And the angels of God ascending and descending upon me, the Son of Man." Now he says upon the Son of Man, perhaps he meant himself and every man. Because the experience of the ladder was something that Jacob saw, and we might not see it, but we will have that experience all the same. It's a warning sign that something serious is about to happen. With Jacob standing in front of Pharaoh, Not so much later, a couple of hundred years later, Israel was in a dire situation there in Egypt, and the disciples of Yeshua the same. Not long after this expression that Yeshua did in John chapter 1, there was this Roman action to make Yeshua captive and crucify him, and thousands of Jews with him. I started with, and I will end with, this distance between heaven and earth. The digit 130 becomes visible, 130, because of the letter and the name of that word and the numerical value of that word in Hebrew. And because of the standing of by Jacob in front of Pharaoh, there is a connection, I think, because this standing in front of Pharaoh and having this unique confrontation of a Jewish man with an Egyptian king was when Jacob had the same age as the numerical value of the letter. Letter, connection, future. What is there of what more meaning is here? Well, the normal age is set in the Bible in Genesis, already in Genesis 6 verse 3. It says, the Lord says, my spirit will not abide in humankind forever, for he's body, he's physical. His days will be 120 years. Now there are exceptions. Adam was 130 years when he died, Abraham 175, Isaac 180, Jacob 147. But the value of life is expressed in 120. The letter numerical value is 130. So the letter might say something about keeping courage under severe situation, but also the letter with 130, carrying 130, carries a message of 10 beyond 120 years old. In other words, your greatest experience of the letter with the descending and ascending angels will be when you die. Why? Heaven is close, only a letter's length. At the same time, heaven is accessible for people who died on their shortcomings, on their old nature, on their quarreling, their resistance, their hardening of heart, beyond their earthly tricks. Most of us will succeed in this only when we die. Before that, we're still struggling with all these things, don't you think? Exception is the prophet Elijah, who already had his latter experience literally when the chariot of God came to pick him up. And special is that Yeshua is using this latter experience in order to show his role, and an important part of his role, and that is this Nathanael person, student in John 1 verse 52, and we all will have our tests in our lives, and we will have our ways of responding to these tests, and the way we respond will say something about our eligibility for paradise, for heaven after this life. So the whole message today is learn to see heaven, and the letter which comes down on Yeshua, who is the key to climb up that ladder. You cannot go besides him, you need to go through him, it says in Hebrews. Through him, via him, you will be allowed to climb that ladder at the moment that God has decided for you. Now you might have some influence on the moment that you die. It's not all in God's hands. Ultimately, everything is in His hands. But we can shorten our lives by doing stupid things. Crossing railroad tracks on the wrong moment is one of them, and stuff like that. So, but in general, the right moment, the ladder is there when you are eligible in terms of your spiritual growth. Then the heavens are waiting. But now, in this life, like Jacob once stood in front of Pharaoh in some kind of a lion's den, we are applying the art that Yeshua was giving to this Nathanael and then to all of us, which is the art we are learning of today. Make sure that you are guiltless as much as you can, as much as in your power. And then place Yeshua between yourself and a situation. Yeshua is here, here's you, and in the middle, here's you, and here's the miserable situation, and in between you place Yeshua. Whatever you meet in your life, try to have Yeshua in the middle. You cannot even see the situation anymore because Yeshua is covering the sight. Place Yeshua between you and somebody or something of which you can receive damage. And this will be your latter experience when you have this place where God is warning you, whether He shows you the ladder or not. It's all the same a ladder experience of which we learn today, and in which God says, make sure you cannot change your situation, but you can change yourself. And you will look upon the difficulties, like the Psalm says, in ways that you couldn't even imagine when you change, and you change in such a way that you're mastering the situation. You're above the situation without changing the circumstances, but you are changed, and you will look at it as a moment of an opportunity to grow on the hand of Yeshua who leads you up the stairs. And with that, that's the end of the study. I say to you, Shabbat Shalom.